And today we're going to do a lecture. Ostensibly, it's on urban design as a kind of body of thinking that originates in the US by that name. And so, in a way, what you're hearing about today is what I was taught as that's all that urban design was this. So I'm going to kind of do it as an overview, and some of you who are architects might know some of it, in which case we can, it's a bit of revision. And for those of you who don't, welcome to modernism and etc. And so part of it is also I've been aware that we've been talking about people that you might not know about as planners. And as landscape students who've actually been up all night, so presumably they're not coming to class and they're going to watch it on video. Now, so that means probably logically we have to start with Le Corbusier and also with the Athens Charter. And so even though we're talking about the US here, and I should just say that when I talk about this stuff, because I did my PhD with a historian, I try not to ever say, here is the principle. I try to say, here is a principle that is historically situated within a body of knowledge, because I don't think we can accept knowledge as being automatic. And so when I was taught, this was just all there was. And so now, after 30 years, I'm realising it's more diverse, but I still think it's important to kind of explain it. And so in terms of modern architecture, and I think in a way one thing you can say about planning and architecture, and to some extent landscape architecture in this period, is that they ran very closely with each other at this particular point of time. If we think the fact that planning was something that was sort of like, in a way it was town and country planning originally, and so it's always had some interest in the sort of physical layout of places. And so this was a period when architecture and planning, I would say probably more that architecture was pushing into the space of planning. And so this is Le Corbusier, and if you haven't heard of Le Corbusier, I'm sure you all have, but Le Corbusier, born Charles Edward Généré, was kind of one of the greatest modern architects in the 20th century, and was with Mies van der Rohe probably and Frank Lloyd Wright probably, which you'd probably regard them as the great architects of that period. Now, the Congress, the International SIAM, which is the Congress International of Modern Architecture, that was a conference that was established that was around modern architecture, and to some extent it was a collection of practitioners, and it was ideological, and the influence of it was enormous to the built professions in terms of particularly how it framed modern architecture in relationship to planning. And so if we start here, then we're looking at, I suppose, one of the things that Matteo mentioned in passing was the Athens Charter. And so I thought, let's start with the Athens Charter and then unpack it. And so the Athens Charter, consists of a series of, and this is a kind of like an archival copy of the brochure from it. It really comprises a series of things around the idea that the city is in a regional setting, and further that the city is a kind of functional space, and it's sort of functionalist city. And so obviously there we're talking about dwelling, recreation, work, transport, etc. And so the importance of this, I think it's important to talk about it in relationship to some of the projects of Le Corbusier, and as we go through, we'll keep touching on this. And I think it's also important to realise that time and practice, theory and practice, have a kind of funny relationship when it comes to the kind of building of cities. Sometimes things take a long time to get down the pipe to practice. And so what this lecture really is talking about, the intersection of modern architecture and the rise of something you might call postmodern architecture or urbanism, and the kind of crossover between the two, which is a period of about 50 or 60 years. And so in this document, and it really specifies a range of different things. If you look at it, you can see, that it's sort of got things, it's sort of criticising something, and then it's unpacking something, and then obviously some of the things that come out of it are things like residential areas should occupy the best place in the city from the point of view of topography, climate, sunlight, and availability of green space. They should be determined, should be put together on the basis of health, etc. If we go to things like recreation, they recommend that all residential spaces should have sufficient open space. They talk about work. They're saying the distances between workplaces and dwelling places should be reduced to a minimum. Industrial sectors should be separated. And so what we're picking up here is the start of a language of functional zoning. And so as soon as the key things that you hear out of here are ideas that some use should be concentrated somewhere else, or some use should be spaced. Concentrated as in intensified, spaced as in distributed away from something. And so a lot of this is around the dynamic between the house and the place of work. And because some of the places of work are also places of industry, there's a kind of functional and environmental separation between industry. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because this is the basis still of, not from this route, but this is still the basis of most planning policy in some sense or another, is the distribution and spacing of things. And it's very tied to this next one. I know Dave is going to talk a lot about this in his lecture, but I think it's important to put, this is in a way preparing the space of understanding that Dave and his contemporaries at Cape Town, and Cape Town had a really strong school of urban design, which is what I've asked him to talk about. He's an individual, he may choose to talk about whatever he chooses to talk about. But he was part of a really important period at the cusp of modernism. Political, was also quite political, and he'll talk more about that. But I think that one of the things I know that he hates is the transport. And so one of the things you can see here is that they're talking about, in a way, based on the European city, transport as an agglomeration of additive modes that have all added one to another without organised sort of planning. And so, what they're instead proposing that it's an analysed, it's use of statistics, there should be hierarchies between them. And so in a way what it's doing is it's putting design thinking onto pretty much everything. Now, the importance between these parts is that essentially you're talking about once you distribute something, you have to find a link between it. And so in a way, a lot of this is predicated around this world that was the world of the automobile. And so in summary, and this is, I'm going to thank some random academic on the net for putting their PowerPoint up there without their name on. Thanks, random academics. So, well-ventilated open space, separation of residences from workplaces, exclusive space for cultural activities near residences, and the separation of vehicles and pedestrians in a rough sort of way. And so if we look then at what that comes out of, there's a book I found that I've got in my bookcase actually that I have never looked at, which is a tragedy, but the good thing of having a bookcase is you can look at it later. And so this is a book concerning town planning by Korb. Unfortunately, the scan doesn't give us many words. But if we start to look at, it's based around a whole series of kind of questions. And if you look at it, you can pick up the Athens Charter, and he talks about the Athens Charter, and I'll put a PDF of this up. There was somebody asking for more information. But in a way, is that?
Should be the Athens Charter should be included.
Yeah. And so otherwise I'll put these particular scans up. But first of all, it's first thinking about this idea of the region. So that's, for architecture, that's a growth. In a sense, planning has always had a regional aspect to it. But for architecture, the growth to the region is in the same, and you can see how it's drawn, in a way, the language that Korb would work with the region and the language that Korb would work with the individual dwelling is the same drawn language. And so this represents a kind of a continuation of the musculature of modernism. And so when we look at these, initially we can start to see these drawings here are showing the way that the organic city has grown. And so instead what he starts to look at and starts to propose are these sort of relations where we have a sort of a central area, we have a linkage onto a major road, and then we have residential and other land uses organised. We can see that there's a kind of interest in how landscape and buffering and those things work. You can see here again propositions around the distribution of those kind of functions. And you also see one of the things that represents a kind of clearer picture of, that we've talked about a number of times, is this idea of a reorganisation of urban form by aggregating at density to create an open space beneath. As we keep going, we'll start to see those sort of relations develop. We see things that come from his, is it 4 principles of art? What's it called? The Bears and Architecture of the, how many is it? 5. Tell me the 5 architects. Roof garden.
Yeah.
Pilote off the ground, right?
Yeah.
Is that 4? Anyway, so the sun. That's right. So what you can see in a way here is that there's a confluence between, or a kind of thing between the principle being played out in a kind of regional city scale, coming right down to the building. And so this is a kind of totalizing principle. And if we go to that and some of the critiques about it, I suppose. This is the kind of model, and again, these are the similar sort of drawings. Terrible. But you get the idea in terms of the way that we have housing areas in landscape, we have intensified areas that are of offices, etc., and then we have the kind of focus on the transportation, the valorization of the transportation node. And so, when those things happen, obviously after that we have also the prototype, which was the Unity of Habitation in Marseille. And so in Marseille, this building is very much organised in terms of, and we can see an approach that's really important. Here is the individual dwelling unit, and the dwelling unit fits into a structural framework. The way that the building sits in the landscape is modelled around this kind of relation. And, at the end of it, you pick up here is the modular. And so it's, in a way, it's a conception that goes right from the individual, the scale of the individual, trying to propose understanding the kind of ergonomics of the individual, right up in scale up into the region. And so it's a kind of totalising sense. And so even though the Athens Charter seems to be just about planning, what we discover, and ways of living, what we discover is that it's really tied to Le Corbusier's proposition. Now, that's a sort of an aside because of the fact that we're not talking about that. What we're actually talking about is urban design. And so Siam had a whole lot of people at it and it developed over a number of years, and we'll talk about how it fell to pieces. But in 1956, Harvard University had a conference on urban design, and it was called the Harvard Conference on Urban Design. There were 2 of them. And so this book is sort of dedicated to that on the 50th anniversary. And, if we look at it again, and it was run by this guy, Sert, and Sert was involved with the Siam conferences and personally brought Le Corbusier to the US. He was involved in building at Harvard and, New York. Was it New York? Did he do the United Nations? Was that?
New York.
Yeah. And the United Nations. And I mean, as an architect, Sert, this is his Miro Foundation in Barcelona, and it was very much a piece of modernism. And so even though Sert ultimately became sort of better known in the US as the head of the Harvard Graduate School of Design and as the sort of founder of urban design as a discipline, what we can pick up is some things straight away. Now, if we look at the difference, we're talking about 30-odd years between, or 20-odd years between the Athens Charter, and let's just, remind ourselves of what those principles roughly are, again, before we leave it. Ventilated space, green spaces and houses in green spaces, separation of residences from workplaces, place for cultural activities near residents, and, separation of circulation, but with an emphasis on circulation. And, when we look at what was being proposed at Harvard by Sert at that time, we can pick up within it a whole lot of those sort of modes that come with modernism. So we're talking about modernism. But at the same time, and it's worth remembering, this is what a conference looked like in those days. Isn't that nice? Like 2 women, a whole lot of men, and, But interestingly and very importantly here, the picture's not the best, but we have here Ian McHarg, who was a landscape architect from University of Pennsylvania. We have all of the people we're going to talk about, Kevin Lynch, we have Edmund Bacon, etc. And we have Jane Jacobs. Now, Jane Jacobs was one of the speakers at the conference and was a really important in this period, and in a way, you would have to say that Jane Jacobs was very busy in a way refuting urban design at the time when this was happening. And so there's a countercurrent in urban design. In actual fact, if you go back to the extracts from that first urban design conference, one of the ones that's really interesting is that Lewis Mumford, who I'll talk about in a second, is really already talking about the the role of form being too great in urban design. And he says, if this conference does nothing else, it can at least go home and report on the absolute folly of creating a physical structure at the price of destroying the intimate social structure of a community's life. And so that's 56. And so we see, while modernism in a way had become, by the 50s, modernism is the norm. Modernism is the basis of lots of things. And interestingly, of course, it's tied very strongly in America to the post-war suburban boom. And so, in a way, if you read what CERT is talking about when they start this conference and they start these programs, what they're really focused on is sprawl. And of course, that's really interesting because we're still focused on sprawl. We're still focused on it in a way that's not too dissimilar to what it was at the time. But specifically, in a way, at that particular moment in the post-war boom, what had happened was the suburban house as a modern piece of architecture. And so suburbia at that time was actually having a real architectural boom. Some of the great landscape architects and architects were working on suburban projects. They were working within the language of modernism. But there was a distaste for sprawl, and urban design was very much focused on that thing. And so on the one hand, you have this awkward thing with modernism and its relationship to capitalism, which is that it has social values. It's paternalistic. It's really focused on trying to fix things, but at the same time, it's become a very commercial exercise. It's become something where it's about delivering houses, freedom of choice, the rights of people to live in suburbia. And so what we're really looking at is that if we think about 1933 here, where suburbia had not yet actually taken off, where there's a Eurocentric discourse around how to work with old cities, and by this time, 20 years later, a European architect and a lot of people who are looking at European cities are criticising suburbia because it lacks the very qualities that some of the people were disliking the old cities for. Too congested, too dense, etc. And so, did you want to add something?
See this picture? I don't know if you noticed that this.
Oops, hang on. I'll see if I can zoom in there.
This is Paris. This is Notre Dame, Paris. The very core of Paris. And this part was built, no? So.
Yeah. So that's right. So this is the Point Voisin for Paris, and so that's right. I didn't introduce enough the violence of that. So that proposition is a particularly violent proposition, but as a model, he was also working on it as a more general model called the modern city. And so to return to this sort of strand, there's an interesting thing we can pick up here, which is that obviously it starts from modernism. It's a critique of suburbia. It's attempting to try to deal with sprawl. And if we go further, we move into the start of the fact that there's a kind of a sort of like an overlap here. And so this is Robert Moses. And again, Tanya will be talking a lot more about the planning, what I've been calling the backlash against planning, but people like Jane Jacobs. But, this is a guy called Robert Moses. And in the period, around sort of in the 1930s through to the 1950s, he was really undertaking a massive reorganization of New York City by trying to put in a new distributive arterial network through the city. And that arterial network was really reflecting the fact that car ownership had increased and that the city was poorly adapted for the congestion that was arriving. Now, this idea of removing congestion is fundamental to the entire discourse of modernism in relationship to the city, because it also became a justification for building new infrastructure, which in itself had its It had its own, was both a physical sort of monumental thing, but also fit within the sort of instrumental ideas of the modernist city. And so here's a kind of classic example of Moses' work here, where we can see how housing, new modernist housing is developing, how there's an infrastructure spine, connections onto freeways, and a kind of valorising through this kind of architecture of the sort of muscularity of infrastructure. And so by there, if anyone went to the thing about the foreshore the other week, we'll know that that approach is the approach that ended up getting the foreshore built, obviously. So this is the same period. We're talking about the period when that sort of thinking was happening and those reports were happening. So part of dealing with sprawl is always seen to be dealing with congestion in some sense, which is one of the effects of sprawl. But at the same time, as we know now, the creation of more traffic infrastructure acts to increase sprawl, it doesn't fix anything in that sense. Doesn't mean we can't fix it. So then we get to 1960 and we get to Kevin Lynch. And so Kevin Lynch was one of the people who was at this urban design conference here, but in the kind of classic way of the US, he was a student and then an academic at MIT, and MIT and Harvard are down the road from each other, basically in Cambridge, and one's the tech college and one's the old school university. And so at MIT, MIT's also been strongly known for its sort of scientific points of view and ways of operating, and there's a dynamic within Kevin Lynch's work that is like that. And I should say that also all the way through this is an idea, and all the way through this is an idea that science helps and statistics will help us solve rationally through a kind of algorithmic process, allow us to solve problems through design. So there was an idea that there was a correlate between science and design. And that's how congestion works, because we can map traffic numbers, we can then say this piece of infrastructure suits this piece of traffic numbers, and we can start to fix everything up like that. If we look back to what Mumford was saying, he was saying in actual fact we can't do that at the expense of community structures, etc. So Kevin Lynch there's a body of work, and I'm going to talk about it as a body of work because I think it's important, and I pretty much have hated it most of the time, but I'm getting more tolerant of it as I go through. Now, the image of the city was one of his most famous books, and definitely one that has had a huge influence on landscape architecture, urban design, etc. And so, if you think about the reading that we got from Graham Shane, the thing that I think is really important to remember is that all of this is about modelling. Even before we used computer models, it's all about modelling. Because what we're doing is we're producing model after model after model of what a city is. And we're mapping models on top of models on top of models. If you think about the fact that Graham Shane's model that we talked about had this idea between the enclave, the armature, and the heterotopia. If we think about Aldo Rossi, who we've talked a little bit, he had the idea of the monument and the typological framework. If you think about virtually every person who talks about urban design talks about those things. And if they have an ability to influence them, inevitably what they want to do is they want to create a monument rather than to create a piece of typology. But because this is about what is the agency of the person in the city, what can they really do? How can a designer operate within the framework of a city which is self-organising around money, is kind of like entirely, they're pretending that they have control over the city. And in a way, when we get to talk about Koolhaas, and also in African cities, we'll talk about the idea of whether this control is a myth and whether there's other modes of working in the city that aren't based on that. And so, modelling the image of the city is important because it's also recognising that the city is an aesthetic space, and this is something we've been talking about. And so you have to see a lot of this within that idea of reading the city from the eye level. We talked about this in the role of the subject before, where the subject is walking through space. And so the image of the city in a lot of Lynch's books, as we know from Graham Shane's analysis and writing about it, I mean, it's full of diagrams to try to explain different sorts of things. And so this idea of diagramming, the idea of drawing and picking up what's there is really, really important to that mode. And so here are the main items of Lynch's methods, I suppose. If we think about them in relationship to the other things we've seen, we can see some sort of correlates. We're talking about the path. We're talking about some idea which was called the armature by Shane, and I'm not sure what Rossi called it. He called it armature too, right? I think Rossi did. But nonetheless, the idea that there is always some sort of connecting framework, and incredibly, that there is within a sort of fabric of the city, there is district, which we could substitute enclave. In other words, some space that is cohesive, whether it be visually, experientially, community-based. In other words, something comprehensible within the city structure, that there are, in a way, edges to districts and potentially other spaces, and then that there are nodes and landmarks. And so the idea that if we can immediately see in the head very simply here, which is we're talking about a circulation system that goes from node to node. Some nodes are more significant, in which case they're based around some landmark. That the road, the path itself forms an edge to a district. And so we're getting how this is working. It's pretty straightforward. But in what it is, it's a way of trying to move a formal thinking, a sort of planning thought process into some design-based mode. And a lot of that is that way of working. Because in a way, if you analyse an existing city, you're analysing something that's not been designed as if it's been designed. You're walking through the city and saying, I love this doorway. Let me measure it up and look at it in this beautiful experience. Let's walk backwards and forwards a few times, get our feeling of the threshold, get a tape measure. Oh, here's a new project I'm going to do. I know, I want that feeling of gateway. What was that gateway like in Rome that I went to? Move that across to there. This is the modelling process, and we'll talk about this more and more. And so in that sense where, where the city also in the similar way to Cullen, Lynch is super, and also to Alexander, these guys are super focused on the urban space and architecture collectively making urban space that has a sort of spatiality that's like the old city in Europe as a critique of the increase of sprawl. They're not seeing modernism as the problem with the city. They're still seeing that modernism can use the same principles as the classical or the self-evolved city, and they can be ported into modern architecture. Now, Lynch's intellectual project is really interesting and diverse, and so I'll keep going through it for a second. And so, for example, here is another book of Lynch's, which was site planning, and in site planning he then actually works with a very similar approach, which is operationalised, where he starts to sort of diagram out and work with things where we're working from circulation systems, we're producing diagrams that show the connections and show the nodes, and then the design evolves itself out from an expansion from the node. And so even though it started as an urbanistic framework, it finds its way right the way through Lynch's methods into landscape design and site planning more generally. Now, Lynch also was very involved in trying to understand the city of the space of the road. And so this is where, if you think back to the Athens Charter with its emphasis on transportation, what we're starting to do is we're starting to see the proposition that the city the process of moving in a car is seen to be kind of cinematic. It's seen to be kind of distorting of views. And so we can see here a series of these drawings from Lynch and Appleyard's book where they try to explain the sequence of views that a car gets along a particular route in relationship to the visual experience. That's the same visual experience that they started to propose around how the city is seen in Cullen, and that we should be actually sequencing this process. Now, it's telling that these were not negative things. This was seen as this is what the road should look like. Not so dissimilar from Corb, sequencing of buildings, openings, closing the end of a tunnel, opening up. So it's theatrical, you know, and that same way of freezing the view, unpacking the narrative that we saw in the old city now transposed into the new. Now, obviously, Lynch also had these city models that he talked about in Good City Form, and there were 3 of them. What were they? They were in the essay from Graham Shane, really early in that essay. City of Faith, the city as a machine, and the ecological city were the ones that he talks about. Where the city of faith, in a way, is the nodal city. Well done for turning up after an all-nighter. Yes, well done. And so, you know, the city of faith is, here is the church on the square. It's a particular, it's again Rossi's idea of the monument, the thing, the node, with the background type fabric. The city as a machine is the Corb city, the city where differentiated uses are joined together through transport services, which is sort of quasi-scientific in its use of statistics, and the ecological city, which is really starting to see the city as a network of systems. And ultimately, that's the one that's been the longest persisting. Now, if we move along this framework, we see a couple of other, this sort of time period. We also see, you know, and you know, if we just, there's one book I didn't describe there, which I think is really important, is, well, these two, which are, you know, what time is this place? So where, in actual fact, this represents the process of Lynch beginning to deal with the fact that there's a disjunction between modern architecture and the old, and how we negotiate between the palimpsest that's history. We go back to the Athens Charter. We also see there's stuff in there about how to deal with history. And also we see Managing the Sense of a Region in 76. This is the ecological city coming back. Now, there's a few other people here that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to kind of move through them quite quickly. At that time also was a really important person called Lewis Mumford, and Lewis Mumford wrote a book called The City in History, and he was originally a kind of literary person, and so one of the things he early on analysed, he wrote this book called The Culture of Cities, and so his way into the city was really through a kind of cultural reading, but his writing at this particular moment of time in modernism was in a way a bridge between history and the kind of methods of Lynch and people like that. And so, you know, a lot of the time we've been talking about the old city, and it's really because we've come through a framework where the city as the form of the city as a kind of an evolved model is something that we can really utilise. But as I mentioned, by the time urban design's happening, he's very worried about communities. He's very worried about, in a way, how his writing is being co-opted into modernism. Now, if we go along further, we'll see that there is we get to this guy called Edmund Bacon. Now we've got a nexus between Harvard, which is this kind of normal thing. Harvard blows its trumpet as being the head of everything, but a lot of the time Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, has some of the better people. And so this book, Design of Cities, is sort of, it's a bit like Mumford's, but it's got another thing going on, which is this kind of air of what I've been calling sort of instrumentality. And so, you know, we've talked about this before, but what a lot of the time Bacon is doing is he's going back and looking at old cities, but what he's doing is really looking at how dictatorial feudal leaders or you know, with people like Sixtus V in Rome, like Haussmann in Paris, how they've dealt with the existing. And if you go think about what Shane was talking about, Lynch, the whole process of urban design is to build form into something which seems disordered. And that's the basic program of urban design. The field is disordered. We have a moment to structure it. How can we structure the field to bring order to it? And so even as modernism's on the wane, history is coming back up. It still hasn't crossed over to being historicism. And here, instead of just looking at the history of how people restructured Rome or Paris, they're saying, what tools did they use to slice through the old city, to restructure the old city with these armatures? So, you know, think armature, node, monument. And so, in a way, monument, node, armature. You know, this is, you can see it over and over. But in a way, it's trying to say this is the field of chaos, and here is this restructuring thing that worked in the past, right? And so it worked in the past. And so what's essentially happened since that period is that Bacon really brings that to bear to try to suggest that modern architecture should utilise similar structuring methods, and here it's sort of valorising Brasilia, should utilise similar structuring methods in the modern city. And so even as it's sort of interested in the density of the old city, the density of Paris or the density of Rome and the dislike of suburbia, it also still wants the monumentality, to imbue the monumentality of the old into the new. So it's really hacking through it. So it's much like Robert Moses' work in New York, and so it hasn't yet sort of realised that this is a problem. And if we look at his own work at that time, you can see, where are we here? You can kind of see in these axonometrics how, let me see if I can get in there, how on the one hand there's the sort of axialities of the Baroque city, but they're also combined with the sort of transport fantasies of modernism. And so there's a convergence of Baroque power with modern architecture. So the history, instead of being architecture as being ahistorical, history becomes the mandate for modernism to do what it does. Now we're going to jump forward to in a really big way to another period that's really important. And this is a particular switch that's happening. It's not over. Modernism's not over yet, but within the movement of urban design, change is coming. And so a lot of that, I think, has to do with, again, this is the University of Pennsylvania, to do with the work of husband and wife team, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. And so together they were a really important team for postmodern architecture. And there's Denise Scott Brown, who, by the way, was actually South African, studied at Wits and then worked and lived in the US. And so what instead they were doing, if you consider that all of this stuff, urban design, was based around rejecting suburbia, instead they were starting to look at the spaces that were arising in suburbia and starting to say, how can we take a different way of reading those places? And so they undertook a studio project. In actual fact, it was with people from the University of California in LA, UCLA students, because that's where Scott Brown was teaching. And they, in a way, started to do something which is quite interesting. And this is a famous duck versus decorated shed argument, which is that modernism, in a way, had this idea about truth to materials, design coming from program, things being really linked together. And so instead, in a way, the best thing was where there was integrity running from the detail through to the building. And instead, what Scott Brown and Venturi found, and their students, and Steve Eisenhower, that there was no relationship between the building's function and what the building looked like. So, in other words, it's a duck, but it's actually a decorated shed. It's actually a shed that looks like a duck, compared to what they said what modernism would be, which is it's a duck all the way through. So the Opera House. The Sydney Opera House. It's the Sydney Opera House, right from the flush button in the bathroom right through to the view of the harbour. Whereas what we're finding is this idea that the dynamics of construction is such that what the building looks like, what it proposes, is totally detached from what it is. And this changes things because it means that no longer can one rely upon the civic in the city anymore. Instead, the civic is now tied to the commercial. And so a lot of their work also is trying to look at, for instance, sort of spacing. And so you can see here, this is a kind of like a sort of a cheeky look where they're saying, here is the spacing of the Villa Radieuse, and here is the spacing of English Gardens and Versailles, versus here is the spacing along a freeway and along the Vega Strip. So they're really showing also how the monumentality of the old city has also been radically transformed by the car. So instead of it being you have a massive axis that's you'd have to walk through and take you half a day to get there, you're now in a car going from point A to point B. Scale has changed, it's the same way that meaning has changed. Now, from that particular point, we start to see a kind of an interesting convergence occurring. At the same time as Venturi, and the reason why I'm putting Venturi here is that in actual fact, even as Venturi and Scott Brown are saying that meaning has disappeared of modernism, that we are looking back to the existing landscape, there's still a movement in architecture to this what I call essentialist reading. And we've talked previously about Christopher Alexander, but Christopher Alexander is also was also quite involved in the end of the Siam, the end of that movement, because there was a thing called the Team 10, which is the 10th Congress of Architecture, and basically those guys chose to have a picnic and they cancelled the conference. And that's regarded as the end of modern architecture in a sense. And so at that time, it was sort of a moves in architecture where there's still a pursuit of modernism. So there is still a kind of like a modernity in terms of formal language. There's still a kind of a process of working with these sort of structures that are focused around circulation. But we can start to see this sort of, with the rise of the digital, with the rise of science, this sort of cellular approach to the city. And so it's moving from object to object to the building being a continuous object. And that's something that later on came to be called megastructure. And megastructure was something where, in a way, they talked about collective form. And so, interestingly, when they thought about that, so this is part of a kind of rearguard action from modern architecture to maintain modern architecture but keep the changing learnings that were happening through the evolving city. And so they worked on this idea of sort of collective form, this famous essay by Markey, where they look at the idea of the city in miniature and collective form inside a building, really. And for Christopher Alexander, it's sort of surprising that he's part of this. But he was, and a lot of what he was doing was trying to bring the things that he was analysing in European cities and these sort of principles and trying to insert them into the megastructure. And so in the sort of spaces in amongst this, we have nooks, crannies, views, corners, gateways, thresholds, all of the stuff from the old city embedded within the frame of modern architecture. And so that's interesting. We see that that's coincident with Venturi and Scott Brown beginning the process of looking to the everyday city. And in that period of overlap, most of the cities in the world built brutalist architecture. And if you go to the Civic Centre in town and look at the deck and the transport interchange and the tower, that's all part of this idea when urban design was monumental architecture all joined together into megaform. And so that tapers off into the 80s. Places like, and that Civic Centre was probably built in the 80s. In Brisbane, in Australia, the whole of the South Bank precinct as a continuous building of galleries, museums, libraries, one continuous building. And so these movements sort of taper off and move over the top of each other. We're getting towards the end here, and I want to sort of flag, it's 20 years, but you know, in the space between these two, you need to see that there is a pitched battle going on between the end of modernism and a community response to planning. And the reason I'm not talking about it is that's what Tanya is going to talk about. Because there's a massive groundswell against modernism that occurred and the entire basis of city planning and urban design changed. And so jumping through 20 years, by the time we're going to go to the last two things I'm going to talk about, which is that we have a period that I find really interesting, because it's also the period when I was educated, where people are starting to look at the sort of crazy hybrids that are coming up in the world. And so there's a book that's put together edited by a guy called Michael Sorkin, and there's an essay in it that for me was very important. The book was called Variations on a Theme Park, and in actual fact, this is the West Edmonton Mall, and Margaret Crawford wrote about that as a miniaturization of the entire world into a mall. And this is an urban design thing because even after the end of modernism, the freeways have been built. Everything has been sprawled. And so, ironically, the megastructure now becomes the mall, got to via the motorway. We don't need a description of this, we live this. This is how we live. And inside the mall, the street is inverted inside out, and so the exterior becomes the interior, and we occupy a simulated heterotopia inside a piece of it's the end of the logical endpoint of what was started by this desire for zoning, spacing, transport, etc. But instead of hating it, Margaret Crawford starts to talk about this as, this is the landscape we're occupying, this is how we're working, and so how do we work with it rather than against it? And so this is what I've been involved with a lot in my practice in Queensland, in Australia, which has been trying to say, so the mall is a type, so the car park is a type, so what's known as the strip mall, where you park in front and there's a whole lot of shops in a little row, that's a type. If there's no civic space today, what do we utilise to optimise those spaces and to play around with the typology to bring something out? And that's something that's known as everyday urbanism. And it's also something where, in the context, for instance, of LA, which is where Crawford works, at Berkeley, she's been doing a lot with working with informal trade in the Latino suburbs, etc., and trying to work with the modalities of the reality of what's happening in the landscape, not the mythologized European thing. Sorkin goes in a whole other strain, which I might speak about later, around starting to explore planning codes, and I think my res is not good enough, but this is a book called Local Codes, which is absolutely incredible. I won't really talk about it again, because it's a way of designing a city via a game, in a way, and it's using words to generate cities. So in postmodernism was a kind of interest also in play and games. And finally, as an introduction to something which is actually going to unfortunately come at the end because we lost a week, I had to get it back. If we look at the endpoint, the logical endpoint to a lot of this period, what we get to is something that's become known as new urbanism, but started a bit differently. And because Cordia Lowe is going to give us a whole lecture on new urbanism, I'm going to talk more about this book by a guy called Peter Calthorpe and a really important principle, which is transit-orientated development. Now, transit-orientated development is another one of those principles which is inherently embedded now. You don't even really need to talk about it. And so Calthorpe, who is part of the Congress of New Urbanism, but is kind of on the edge of it, on the less crazy edge of it, really, if we look at what it's really trying to do, in a way, even though it's kind of anti-zoning, it's a zoning that's based, instead of being based around a separation of zones where this land use is here and this land use is here, it's in a way a bit more cellular, where it would say there's a relationship between a land use, a commercial or a workplace land use, and a residential land use and public land uses that is about avoiding transport, avoiding movement by a car, maintaining walking distances or close transit distances, and in a way de-zoning into a zone that's more based around distances such as, this 400-metre walking distance. But it is still zoning, but it's on a sort of a point-based. So instead of the node being monument, it's like Todd, armature between Todds. That's the way it sort of works. And as you get through it, you can start to see how these systems work. And a lot of it's also about localising in amongst traffic infrastructure. If traffic infrastructure's inherent mode is to distribute and is to space, instead this is about inserting other grades within that put a fineness and identification of place within a framework that is otherwise monumentally separated. And so it's a sort of regrading exercise. Now, I've always found that I have zero problem with these kind of ideas. They're very common sense sort of things, and if you do work on this project, this is what you end up doing. It's just common sense. The thing that happens with architecture is particularly that the aesthetics of new urbanism tends to be historicist and vernacular and a bit sort of theme parkish in its own right, with Seaside being the most famous, but I'll leave Cordia Lowe to talk about that in her lecture. And so if we look at this whole process here, just before I finish, then one thing that we are looking at is really how in a way, the ideas of Athens Charter and modern architecture around those principles of distributing traffic, separation of land uses, how they transmute when they get to the United States, in a way they start to be mitigated by learnings from the European city that are trying to sort of get control of the beast, but the beast has not yet been identified because the beast is still treated as suburbia here. There's still this valorisation of transport, massive valorisation of transport during this period with a sort of a turnover, and then this sort of process of humanisation, you could say, humanisation of the modernist city by bringing back and analysing and developing methods from older cities, and the development of all of these kind of models. And then we end up in this sort of the kind of kickback against urban design and against urban modernism by trying to find methods of working with the existing landscapes of the west, of the kind of non-European city, first in a kind of provocative postmodern kitsch sense, but then ultimately as a kind of reality in which people live.